And it is my pleasure to welcome you to our annual Memorial September 11th lecture. We do this every year to remember the almost 3,000 Americans who lost their lives on that fateful day 13 years ago. So before we begin, I'd like to take a moment of silence for us to bow our heads and remember the 3,000. Thank you very much. We'd like to say the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Sarah, thank you very much for the invitation again and for what you are doing for this cause, first in defense of America, of the free world, and also of Israel and all the peace-loving people in the region. I'd like to thank all of you for being here tonight, and I know many among you now, some directly, some online, some offline. So it's always a pleasure to come back to the EMET events and have a conversation about the state of national security, the state of the fight for freedom, and on 9/11. This is the day in our modern history, at least, where we reflect upon those matters, because America that day was attacked in its heart by a jihadi movement, by a jihadi organization then called Al-Qaeda. And more than a decade later, we are still in the battlefields overseas and even here at home, facing off with the jihadists. And this time they have many more names. Today we're talking about ISIS and ISIL and Daesh. And of course, today we are addressing these issues after the president yesterday unveiled his plan to counter ISIS and the terrorists. So thank you again for making this possible. I'd like to quickly, within the 20 minutes I'm going to be using, just refreshing our memory from the past, how the years leading to 9/11 presented us with some evidence that the threat was there, and we missed those opportunities, we missed the understanding. It's very important, even if we are in a classroom and we explain what 9/11 is, which I did today in my own classroom, to go back in time and reflect upon how we missed those signs and how we failed in addressing the threat, because history is made of cycles. And today we are probably living a similar, I would say comparable cycle to what happened before 9/11. Then, reflecting in a second series of thoughts about the years since 9/11. We were attacked, we were hit, we responded. How did we manage that response? Were we successful? Did we defeat? Did we push back against Al-Qaeda, the jihadists, and the other threats? And of course, the years leading to the Arab Spring, and from the Arab Spring on to what's happening today in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and the homeland security growing threat. So this will be my contribution today. In the years leading to 9/11, which I spent as a professor then in Florida, but also coming to Washington often and testifying and briefing members of Congress on two things. One was, as of 1995, 1996, the rise of the jihadi threat. We had 1993 first attack against the Twin Towers. That was very important in order to understand that we were targeted. Unfortunately, the reaction of the administration then was very similar to what this administration wanted events to be, or wanted policies to be. But now the administration is overwhelmed with what's happening in the region. But since 2009, there was an attempt to bring us back to pre-9/11 mindset, meaning there is no such thing as worldwide jihadism. This is just a frustration. This is neo-colonialism. This has to do with the Arab-Israeli conflict. The same narrative, we heard it in the 90s and we heard it a few years ago. That first track was about trying to predict or project the coming strikes or the coming threats by a combination of jihadists. A second track, which was developing also in the 90s, was one of the victims of these jihadists, in addition to democracies, in addition to civil societies, were the minorities in the Middle East. Even in the 90s in Sudan, in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Egypt, there were several acts of aggression by the same jihadi ideology groups against these minorities. So I started to testify, and I made the case in the 90s about two things. Number one, if we do not roll back this ideology by an international effort, it's going to end up forming a global movement. And he just introduced a book that I published later on, which made the case that we are not dealing with an organization only. We're not dealing with the results of the Arab-Israeli conflict. We're dealing with a global movement called the jihadist movement. So I made the case in the 90s about the forthcoming war to be led by the jihadists against America and liberal democracies around the world. And I also made the case that if we do not stop that movement, not just our homeland security will be targeted, but also the weakest among the weakest in the free world, and these were the minorities. Came 9/11. 9/11 sent, of course, a shock throughout America. American public knew since, continues to feel, that there is out there a force that wants us to be defeated, wants us to be withdrawing from the region, and wants to expand in the region. Now, what did we do since 9/11? We developed two things. On the one hand, we went and freed battlefields from enemies, the Taliban on the one hand, Saddam Hussein with all the debates about Saddam Hussein. And we tried to do something else, which is to work within the United States, within the homeland, on pushing back against radicalization, against indoctrination. A third axis started to develop, which was the Iranian axis. So, in the essence of it, the confrontation that the United States and its allies are engaged in, have been engaged in, and actually, let me put it that way, the offensive is coming from a jihadist web, on the one hand, and from an Iranian axis, happening at the same time. So the Iranian regime took advantage of the fact that we were engaged in battlefields, multiple places, to develop on the ground a takeover, a penetration of several countries, and now we're feeling the pressure. In 1980 already, Assad, the father, agreed to have a strategic treaty with the Iranian regime. So that was established. Then Assad invades Lebanon. Iran goes with Assad to Lebanon and establishes Hezbollah. We invade Iraq, we remove Saddam Hussein, and for the years that followed our invasion, while we were fighting Al-Qaeda, Iran was penetrating the center and the south of Iraq. So I'm putting all these images in motion just to make the case that the war on terror was not a static war. We just went to two places and now we're withdrawing. The war with the jihadists, which is the real main, has been a war of movements. We would move, they would try to contain us, and at the same time they will move to try to fill up the space. Now, in 2009, the United States policy actually has changed, and you, among others, are among the first ones to realize that. What has changed in 2009, which we are now feeling the results of in terms of the confrontation with the terrorists worldwide? Number one, and in my view the most important, was that the Obama administration has declared in 2009 that the war has ended, should end, and that there is no such thing as worldwide jihadi ideology. Remember yesterday when the president said ISIS is not an Islamic thing. I know. We're gonna discuss that. You're gonna discuss that. Well, that is not just his opinion, my feeling. This is the opinion of an academic elite in this town and across the country that has been funded, that has been influenced by petrodollars for many decades. What we have here is a systemic failure. It's not just a political failure. It's not just there's a president with some advisors, they have their own ideas. That's not the case. There is a whole institution that begins on campuses, goes to media, goes to research centers, goes to think tanks. It's gigantic. So the first problem we started to witness as of 2009 was the fact that we have abandoned the ideological warfare, the ideological confrontation. And that has consequences. If you withdraw from the ideological confrontation, what is going to happen and did happen, first overseas and at home, are two dangerous things. At home, when we tell our analysts, our national security analysts, our eyes and ears, those who will have to tell the government that there is a threat in Benghazi, there is a threat in Libya, there is a threat in Syria, how to detect these ideological progress. When these defenses were taken out, we had to meet the threat only when it happened. So in difference with the previous administration, which bureaucracy did not do a great job, let's be very clear here. Even the bureaucracy under the Bush administration had a hard time dealing with the ideological factor. The current bureaucracy plus the administration have no ideological prism. They don't see it. So on the homeland, what has been happening was a growth of the influence of two lobbies. And I'm not reinventing the wheel. All of you, I assume, are aware of that. You have the lobby of the Muslim Brotherhood, the Ikhwan, that has been growing in influence inside the institutions and has been responsible, now this is a new statement I'm making, has been responsible for the derailing of our national security analysis. People will ask, oh, how come the government doesn't know? I've been asked all the time in the media. The government is not an expert. There is an elite expert that explains to the government what is going on, who are to be vetted. Today we're talking about vetting the Syrian opposition. This is a very hot topic. Mm-hmm. And we don't have means to vet the Syrian opposition unless Congress starts vetting the Syrian opposition or trusted foundations. We vet the Syrian opposition. Who do we bring to vet these oppositions? Should it be the rebels in Libya, 2011, or rebels in Syria, or Egypt's various political forces? Well, the expertise that we are using, and that expertise is the result, is the product of the classroom. In Middle Eastern studies, in Islamic studies, and these classrooms for 20, 25 years have been overwhelmed by the petrodollar Middle East studies. So we are toast in terms of our capacity of analyzing. I remember under the Bush administration, the officials would reach out to foundations in the private sector. But that's unbelievable. Why would they reach out to private sector foundations to help them? Because the bulk of what they had in the State Department, and I'm making that statement very clearly, or other agencies, was influenced completely either by the Muslim Brotherhood lobby or by the pro-Iranian lobby. And both are active. And in my book, the latest book, The Lost Spring, and the subtitle, by the way, is interesting. Every time I go on TV, the anchors are smiling. The subtitle is U.S. Foreign Policy in the Middle East and Catastrophes to Avoid. Mm-hmm. I published this in March, and since then, all these catastrophes are rapidly happening. So as of 2009, we've had that change. First of all, in regard to the ideology, with all the real catastrophes that happened afterwards. And then we had another change, which is the partnership with forces on the ground. And that was happening, 8 years after 9/11. We rechanged the policy. Partnership number one was with the Muslim Brotherhood in the region. A couple years before the Arab Spring, the administration, the think tanks working with the administration and their allies have been reaching out to the Muslim Brotherhood. That is no secret. The Brotherhood said it, both in the region and here. And now the Egyptians and the Tunisians are, sharing this information with us in public, in writing. So there was a policy of giving more visibility, giving support to the Brotherhood. And actually, this was used by the Brotherhood and their Islamist allies at the time when the Arab Spring began. They were already had an advantage over the rest. When the Arab Spring exploded in Egypt, in Tunisia, in Libya, and Syria, well, it was evident that while the first wave And I know some of my colleagues don't even believe there was a first wave. I do believe that there was a first wave. When the first wave took to the streets and they were pushing back against authoritarianism and fundamentalism, they had, after the fall of the dictators, to face off with a very organized movement, well-funded, the Brotherhood. But more important than that, it was given an advantage by Washington. It was the administration that actually walked with the Brotherhood to power in Egypt. Not bringing them to power, but by giving them that visibility and that force. And that's why the Egyptians rose a year and a half later against the regime of Mohammed Morsi and across North Africa. There was another axis that was developed since 2009, and that would explain, the two policies explain the drama we're living today, from Syria to Iraq to elsewhere. That other axis was a projection made by the administration that we can reach out to the Iranian regime. So one arm is the Brotherhood, the other arm is reaching out to the Iranian regime. But why? Because the administration was convinced by the pressure group, I don't want to say lobby, the pressure group that works with for the agenda of the Iranian regime, that regime at the end is rational, will accept partnership. If you reach out to that regime, you will have a friendship with a stable government that's going to give you solutions in Iraq and Syria and elsewhere. Now remember what happened in 2009. Number one, we had a speech, the president had a speech at the University of Cairo. That speech was directed to the Brotherhood. Then a few weeks later, there was a letter sent to the Ayatollah Khamenei of Iran, which meant a message to the other side. And this came to visibility when there was 1.5 to 1.8 million Iranians demonstrating in the streets of Tehran in June of 2009. That was a moment of truth, to me, at least in the beginning of this administration. Had the administration not been developing a partnership with the regime, it would have acted as it did in Egypt or in Tunisia or in Yemen. They would have asked the regime to step down, and we are with the demonstrators. Why not? The Iranians were felt abandoned because there was a deal. I called it in my book the undeclared Yalta. Remember the Yalta agreement dividing the influences. Now, from those moments of 2009 throughout the Arab Spring until now, the development of geopolitics coming from these policies, what do they tell us? They tell us that in North Africa, there was a rejection of this policy. The Egyptians, 33 million Egyptians marched on June 30th of 2013. This, to me, seems to be the biggest event that dislodged the Muslim Brotherhood. And now you have Egypt getting away from the Muslim Brotherhood. Then you had the civil war in Syria, which also demonstrated that the administration cannot make a choice. On the one hand, you have within the opposition, within the armed opposition, jihadists, al-Nusra, the various Islamist fronts. And on the other hand, you have Assad, the regime of Assad, an ally to Iran. That explains why the administration wasn't able to do much, because on both sides, they had investments, political investments. On the one hand, you have the Muslim Brotherhood lobby here in town saying, arm the rebels, but which rebels? The Islamist rebels. And on the other hand, every time Assad goes beyond the red line and we threaten him as we did last year, then the Iranian lobbies say, oh, well, Mr. President or administration, don't go against Assad because Assad is the ally of the Iranian regime, and if we crumble Assad, our deal with the Iranians is gone. So we are stuck in the middle. The administration is stuck in the middle in Syria. Because we were stuck in the middle in Syria, the areas that the jihadists controlled mutated into, from al-Nusra, which is Al-Qaeda, into what we know now as the Islamic Caliphate, or the Islamic State of Syria and Iraq. The genesis of the rise of ISIS is due in part, if not most of it, but at least significantly, is due to our failure in Syria. And our failure in Syria is a product of our failure since 2009 in having a vision for the region, instead of betting on allies, existing allies, first of all. Instead of betting on civil society, instead of helping the minorities, we went in different directions. We did go in those different directions because we were advised to do so by the elites that have been impacting and influencing our foreign policy. And I don't want to digress on Israel. You know as much as I do, and I'm sure other speakers will be speaking, why this administration was not able to make any inch of progress in the peace negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians. Why is it that Hamas was allowed to take back Gaza in the midst of the Arab Spring? So these are major questions. But let me now, since time is closing for me, go back to the current situation. Now that I drew the tableau, as we say. We have ISIS in control of 1/3 of Iraq, 1/3 or more in Syria. We have a complete meltdown of the Iraqi army. We have Assad, an ally of the Iranian regime. We have Hezbollah inside Syria. We have the Pasdaran Iranian Revolutionary Guards in Iraq and in Syria and in Lebanon. How can the United States now deal with the situation? Yesterday, the president outlined a strategic plan. Now, this strategic plan, I made the case this morning in the media, and again tonight, if you watch that, is good if it was done before. Most of the policies of the administration, you know that, are pieces from things that they should have done a while ago. They're coming late. Reorganizing the Iraqi army, of course, we should have done so before we have withdrawn from Iraq. I mean, we pulled out from Iraq, allowed Iran to seize the Iraqi army, and of course, it's not ours anymore. Every dollar we're paying to the Iraqi army today is a dollar that's going to Iran. We should support the Kurds. Really? We should have supported the Kurds a long time ago. The Kurds were begging for support. That's what they told me. Oh, we should send food to the poor minorities and the Yazidis and the Christians. They didn't have to be ethnic cleansed. When ISIS took Mosul, this was the time to do the strikes before ISIS get out of Mosul and start attacking the valleys, the Nineveh Valley and the Sinjar. For every single measure that we're taking, we see that there is a time zone. It's coming late, and when you come late, the price is much higher. And in Syria, we're going to be, bombing ISIS. We know that there are no solutions from the air. The Israelis will tell you that. There are no final solutions in terms of fighting the terror from air. We're going to vet the opposition and send the weapons to the moderate rebels. We've been hearing this since 2011. Many of these moderate rebels that we have armed or allowed armed to go to, guess what? They ended up al-Nusra, and al-Nusra ended up ISIS. So, Mr. President and the administration, you need to renew and change this entire policy. The problem is not anymore in the Middle East. The problem is here in Washington. A new policy has to be redesigned, restructured, and to do so, you're going to reach out to another bunch of experts, to a different school of thinking. You want to keep the old one, keep them in museums. We have a lot of museums out there. Add, I'm very serious, add a different guy. Let's establish a new 9/11 type commission. I am for inclusion. I want to hear what the other side is saying, but it seems that the other side is not hearing what we're saying, what you're saying. It's not been heard. So that's why I would like to thank you for giving us always the opportunity on the, in this podium, in Congress, and other places, to make sure that there is an alternative opinion that the administration will have a chance to listen to. And they do have still 2 years. Many things can be done in 2 years. But some among us, those with whom I'm working, are thinking that the real strategies are going to be after 2016. But let's try to do our best anyway. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity. I can tell you this, that the influence of the Muslim Brotherhood throughout what I call the political establishment in Washington, so you're going to do your own deduction, is very extensive. The think tanks, the research centers on campus, the public media that we are funding and other media have been reached by the Brotherhood widely. And there are research and there are public research about. Now within the actual administration, it will be, there is one part of the question says, do you know who is a Muslim Brotherhood? I don't know. But can you see the Muslim Brotherhood narrative? Of course I can see it. That's public, that's information. The Muslim Brotherhood narrative would be, for example, that jihad is yoga. spiritual yoga, don't worry. That is a brotherhood propaganda narrative. Or, for example, that the reason for why they are jihadists is because of the Arab-Israeli conflict or disenfranchised youth. This is classical Georgetown and UCLA stuff. I mean, we know it. Will Iran get the bomb in the next 2 years? Let me give you a statement I have never made before. If we analyze the perception of the Iranians of us and their determination to obtain the strategic weapon, which is the nukes and the missiles. Missiles are very important. If I am them, then of course the ideal time to produce whatever I want to produce would be the next 2 years. Now, will they or not, that's in the pocket of Ayatollah Khamenei. But if I am the Iranian regime, these 2 years would be the best in modern history to produce what I have to produce. This is not new. Actually, the same lobbies and the same narrative here and in Europe was also about Al-Qaeda. But we didn't pay enough attention. What that means is this. The lobbies, those whose goal is to obtain influence, sometimes they are bugged by those who uncover the full ideology on the spot in the Middle East, because that is going to open the eyes of the public. The difference is between these and ISIS is probably like between the Stalinists and the Trotskyists. You know, the Trotskyists wanted to do revolution everywhere, Aki, Ahora, all that, and the other ones will tell them, no, we have to respect international law until they are strong enough not to, to seize power. So there is some comparison here. When someone says ISIS is not Islamic, it means that don't blame everybody who is Muslim because of what the actions of nobody is blaming all Muslims because of the actions of ISIS, but at the same time, yes, ISIS is Islamists. This is an Islamist movement, there is no doubt about it. I mean, the Arab world is calling ISIS an extreme Islamist. If the Arab world called them jihadists, why do you want to call them something else? And then there is another point that many in the public commenting business say, oh, these are not jihadists, these are criminals, these are barbarians. This is description of, this is not definition. Yes, the Nazis were criminals, the fascists were criminals, the Japanese military were criminals, criminals are criminals, but you've got to identify ideologically what they are. There are various circles, many circles. You have those who are competing with ISIS and they are jihadists, right? The red. Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria. Yeah, they are competing with them. They would like to be the one to attack America and Israel, So these are the competitors, like the Chinese Communist Party and the Soviet Communist Party. They didn't like each other, but they were communists, both of them. And eventually they wanted the planet of the lumpen proletariat. That's the difference. Then you have the Muslim Brotherhood, the orange, the much whiter. And they would criticize them because they think that ISIS is not going to last. They are the ones with a good plan. They're going to penetrate the government and they're going to last. And then you have Muslims who are not jihadists and not Islamists, and they know that this is a threat against them, like ordinary Egyptians or Jordanians or liberal Muslims. It's a great question. I'll repeat it my way. Are the Muslim Brotherhood satisfied with the fact that the United States is engaging Iran? Do they consider this as a threat to their own influence? From what I understand, it's a division, it's a geographical division. The Brotherhood's project, early project, wants to establish influence from Morocco to Gaza, all of North Africa to Gaza, Palestine, and if possible in Syria. The Iranian project goes from Lebanon to Syria to Iraq to Iran, so the Shia axis and the Sunni axis. As long as the United States is empowering the Brotherhood in the Sunni area and Iran in the Shia area, at this point in time, it's a division of geography. But if the United States is going to empower Iran against the power of the Brotherhood in the Sunni areas, then they will be frustrated. So at this point in time, I don't think Iran is a problem for the Brotherhood in our policy. I think their problem is the fact that the American public is becoming more and more aware about their influence. They are very nervous about the fact that more Americans are realizing this influence. And ironically, at least for us, those who are following up on foreign affairs, the participation by Egyptian bloggers and people and seculars in Libya now or in Tunisia gave us a huge amount of information about the Brotherhood, more than the last 20 years of our own research. Okay, I have been arguing for many years, and sometimes to the detriment of my work with other colleagues. I do believe that there's a very strong anti-jihadist feeling sentiment within the Arab and Muslim world. What is not there is the organization and the movement and the freedom for them to act. And more important, what is not there is a help coming from our governments in liberal democracies. If I had the administration, we'd be doing revolutions in the Middle East just by supporting them. And I mean, we missed it in Iran, was clear. But Egypt did not let us mess up their revolution. So I am pretty confident. It's only a question of time, and hopefully in the next years, another Congress, maybe another administration, I really hope those will change. But I really hope that the next ones will be the one to provoke that change in the Middle East.